Hey friends, I've got great news. The MongoDB provided for Entity Framework Core is now GA. Woo! I'm Luce Carter, a developer advocate here at MongoDB, and in this video I'm going to show you a few highlights of my favorite new features available in the GA release. So let's get started. So the first feature we're going to take a look at is support for embedded documents. Now, if you've used the MongoDB C# driver before, you will know that this is pretty normal. But as of GA of the new provider, this is now supported inside of that as well. So this application we have open here is a Foodie Finder console app that is available to look at on GitHub if you wish, and the link will be in the description below. But this uses the sample restaurant database and the restaurant collection. And if you'll see here, something you might be familiar with if you've used a driver, which is these multiple classes inside the restaurant model class. So we have our overall restaurant type here, and then we have address and grade. And these represent types of object that will be embedded or as documents embedded inside of our restaurant. So just like before, if you're used to seeing embedded documents, we now have an address. That address will then be an object or embedded document inside the restaurant document. And the Entity Framework provider will be able to take care of mapping those properties from address into that model so you can use them in your code. Neat! So here we are in the restaurant DB context, and this is where we're going to find the next interesting feature, which is around detailed logging. So all this code will look pretty standard if you're used to Entity Framework. And you'll see a few things here, and they all come from the Entity Framework itself. There's just a couple of things going on under the hood with the provider that make it super cool and super powerful. So here, when we're creating the DB context and we have this options builder, we have enabled sensitive data logging set, which is what helps the provider work with link. But we've also got this additional line here, log to. So in this case, we're calling console.writeLine as where to log to, but you could use any logger that you like. And this logger, or log2 feature, does come from Entity Framework, not the provider. But what is super cool is that when you run the application, it will actually give you some more detailed information about what is going on. So if we have a look at the running application here, we can see that amongst a load of other information, we've got this line here which tells us what query was carried out. So what we were actually trying to achieve, if we have a look at the code again, is we were trying to say, find restaurant by ID. So we've got that here, we pass it an object ID into this method that we've written. So if we go down below and have a look at it, all this is doing is standard Entity Framework stuff. So it's calling the context, calling the restaurant set and saying, find the first or default where the restaurant ID matches the one passed in. Pretty straightforward, but it's using link, of course. So what's cool about the sensitive data logging alongside this log.to is that you're seeing here what query was carried out. So under the hood, it's turned your link query into an aggregate where it's doing a match on the ID with that object ID for the underscore ID passed in. And because we called first or default, under the hood is limiting it to 1. So that's pretty straightforward for something like a find by ID, but this can be really helpful as you start to do more complex queries, because not only does it help you understand and learn how MongoDB queries and aggregations are built under the hood, but can also help you identify fields that are maybe cropping up more often in your searches or queries, and then helping you identify how to improve performance by indexing on those. Nice! So here we are back in the restaurant model class, and this time we're going to be talking about another cool feature that wasn't available until GA, but has always been available in the C# driver, and that is the support for BSON Attributes. So one example and most commonly seen use of this is where you want to give your property names in C# a different name or capitalization to how it's stored in the database. So if we have a look at restaurant here, you're going to see examples of this everywhere, because in C# we have a certain naming convention of how we name properties. So from what I understand, we always start them with a capital letter, and we normally do, I believe it's camel case, so we just start each new word with a capital letter. But of course, documents in MongoDB are often stored with different names. So in this case, they're all starting with a lowercase, or in the instance of something like restaurant ID, that is stored in the document in the sample data as restaurant_ID. So being able to add these attributes again in GA Provider is super helpful because it allows you to maintain that naming convention that you're used to while supporting any field names that you want in your documents. So last but by no means least, we have value converters. So value converters is something that's quite common in C#, and so you might have seen it before. In MongoDB, one of the most common use cases we see for it is where you want to use the string type for your ID. So in MongoDB, the data type that you might have seen from that query earlier, the type for _ID is object ID. Now, this is a data type available to you in C#, but for display reasons, for example, in your front end, you might prefer to keep it in your model class as string type. So in GA of the provider, we now have value converters, and one of the features where that's helpful, of course, is string to object ID for your ID field. So if we have a look at our MongoDB on-model creating method here, this is inside restaurant DB context. And this method is an override, so it comes from Entity Framework, and it just allows you to give some more detail about your entities. So in this instance, where we've got this entity restaurant, we can go ahead and paste some code. And this is saying that for the property ID, it has a conversion for object ID. So now you'll be able to go ahead and store it as a string like you know and love, but store it as object ID, and under the hood, it will take care of all of it for you. So there we have it. A few features available in the new GA release of the provider for Entity Framework. Why don't you give it a try today? Taking advantage of the mental model you already know and love in Entity Framework with the document database that you know and love. Happy coding!